A couple of questions that have come out. So a question here is, I guess, directed at Deanne. It's about narcissism. So are narcissists always people with high self-esteem, or is there a type of narcissist who is actually very insecure? So that's a great question. So
yeah, there is actually. There's also a type of narcissism called vulnerable narcissism. It's just a lot rarer than the sort of dominant form that I talked about. But if you're interested in it, Suzanne Brown is studying this. She's at Durham, so have a look at her work on vulnerable narcissism.
Okay, thank you very much there. And we have another question that is, I am very interested in how genetic traits impact on cumulative culture. So evolutionary psychologists talk about the almost fixed human psychology, but here we are talking about developmental psychologies and culture where traits are important, but culture is equally important. What are the panelists' views on the impacts of genes and culture? Great question there, Matt. Okay, who wants to go first?
I am happy to say something. This is a very interesting questions, and I don't think there is unilateral and unique answer about what we definitely know from studies about the role of genes. Also in developmental psychology, there is huge work that has been done in understanding the development of antisocial behavior in relation to aggression and antisocial behavior. So my beginning of my career, I was actually doing studies on children development in relation to aggression and antisocial behavior. So I know a little bit about this. So the point here is not if there is one element that can explain the behavior. So definitely behavior is multi-determined. We definitely know that there are some aspects that are more stable, but this does not mean that our behavior will be 100% predicted by some stable traits. So here, at least from my perspective and the work that I have been doing across these years, it's the importance of the, what we say, malleable traits, malleable individual dimensions. So also in personality, we look at the broad range of characteristics that can change. And this is why in my presentation, I wanted to end by looking at self-efficacy. So although we might have certain tendencies, for example, we know also in relation to irritability. One of my first studies that I have done on counterproductive work behavior was related to irritability that is more temperamental. However, what we developed across time and the influence of the social context can definitely make a difference in the way we approach our life and the way and our choices when we behave. So in my personal view, it's more complex. And although there are evidence of the role of genetics and some stable traits, it's also very well known the importance of more malleable traits and the role of the social context in changing the way we approach things and then we behave. Hope it makes sense.
Deanne, do you want to add something?
Yeah, I think it's a question of both and. Because over time, of course, genetic influences also get shaped by the context and vice versa. Think also, for example, of the animal research showing, for example, that once a monkey becomes the lead monkey, the testosterone levels go up, and that influences their behavior again, and that also influences the genetic development. So it's a pretty complex intermingling of influences, in my view.
I think we also need to consider that that culture may affect whether the genetic influences are shown. You might have some kind of a preparedness, but culture can influence which kind of behaviors manifest. And culture can also have you also have culture on different levels. I think there's not such one culture. If you want to understand, for example, silence or unethical behavior in the hospital, you have a whole bunch of cultures. You have the national culture, the organizational culture, the professional culture. So I think, yeah, you need to define what are the most important forces, most important influences.
I would just add to that issues about processes, so that there can be particular trends that might go one way, but the situation can change and amend them. And as the others have said, I think it is that combination of those factors coming together, because definitely we know that particularly bad behaviors in organizations change the organization, and therefore it allows other people to start doing it, and that can mean that they feel reluctant to not do the behavior because they would be actually socially sanctioned for not indulging in negative behaviors as opposed to doing corrective behaviors. So what's really interesting as bad behavior spread through an organization is that it becomes self-reinforcing, and those social sanctions that I had on one of my slides start to decline. So people stop talking about it. And you can see that particularly around issues about sexual violence, for example, because it is more accepted in society at a kind of low base level. It means that people feel that there is an ambiguity about it. So very much as Roberta was highlighting, you know, that need for moral education and for highlighting what could be good things, you know, that is really important for people in terms of their own self-regulation, to evaluate, well, what should I be doing in this situation and how can I therefore change? So the great question, right? I'm going to find the other ones. There's another one coming through. So we had a question here, specifically Roberta. You define moral disengagement as doing something bad and not feeling bad about it. Can you morally disengage and feel remorseful after the event? If so, is there any kind of time lag that is common or a trigger that leads to remorse? How dynamic or static is moral disengagement? Great question there, Caris.
Hold on. Now, this is a very interesting question about the dynamic, and actually this reminds me of a big debate that is in the literature about moral disengagement, on looking at moral disengagement as a more trait-based or something that actually changes. My point here is that, again, it's a little bit more complex than that, and also it depends, in my view, of the situations and in the context. So it is true that this way, moral disengagement, in a way, it has been seen as more, that has some stability. However, as we demonstrated, having, let's say, this mindset, so we can use actually as a kind of way of understanding moral disengagement as a mindset, like a tendencies to maybe reframe. This doesn't, again, necessarily mean that this is actually then translated. So here the point is that morally disengage does not mean that we cannot have then an emotional experience that, for example, can be triggered by the context. So there is a very interesting model by Dolly Koo about the understanding the processes of change, basically. How can we change our way? So I am not aware, to answer specifically the question, of a specific time lag, because it depends on what happened next we have behaved. So one thing is that an individual, for certain reasons, based on the consequences of their event, they might, so their self-evaluation might be threatened, and then they engage in some forms of reflection, and this can trigger some emotions and then change. Or you can have the social context, and for example, Michael discussed about, you know, voicing, and so you might have the context that tells you about something. So it's definitely, we cannot think about moral disengagement as something completely stable, because it depends. It depends on the context and what are the triggers that can enable. This is why it's so important, the social context, because we can have situations that can trigger this type of mindset, some cues, and that, so it's, we the social context can enable these forms of remorse and reflection and then changes. So this is my view about the stability versus dynamism of moral disengagement. But these are very great questions, and definitely there needs to more research about this.
So I wonder, Michael, would you have a view? Because I'm just thinking about in terms of silence and then people deciding to speak up.
Yeah, but if I am allowed, I would show another picture that's from the Bandura paper on moral disengagement. You obviously see it. I see it in Roberta. And what I wanted to add is that it might be unlikely that people feel remorse about it, because there are mechanisms that may prevent people from feeling remorse. For example, if you observe bullying, then you may blame the victim, and that's also a process that is involved in moral disengagement. Or another process that Bandura suggests was so minimizing the consequences, that you say, oh, it's not too bad if people are treated a bit rougher. So there are cognitive mechanisms that may prevent people from feeling disengaged. And I think we need to consider this when we think about moral disengagement as a process, as Roberta also suggested. And with the silence issue, of course, you consider the consequences. If you go along well after you remain silent, then that's obviously a positive effect. So it's a short-term effect, and this is positive. And so you won't change your behavior. You don't consider the long-term effect. So as an organization, you have to be immediate and give the immediate response. I think this might help to also cause the reflection on the issue.
Deanne, just thinking, you were talking about the narcissist and also Machiavellian personality. I wonder what place moral disengagement might have for them and self-reflection.
Oh, definitely. I think it's of course a very sort of common reaction, the moral disengagement. We don't like to think of ourselves as bad people, but I think with Machiavellians, they will feel a little bit less need. They're assuming that everybody else is cutting corners as well. So, you know, it's perfectly normal to do that in their world. So maybe they don't need to disengage in the same way that most of us probably would. And for narcissists, they're of course very entitled. So they'll believe that they actually have more right to things than others have. So I think that the processes might be a little bit different, but it would certainly be a very interesting area to study, actually. So perhaps we have our next research project here.
You mentioned right at the start of your talk about the rise of some of these aspects. What do you think is fueling it, particularly in maybe Western society, because that's the most studied society, I'm guessing?
So sorry, I didn't catch the question, Ross.
So you mentioned at the start of your talk that, you know, these aspects of that we call the dark triad are starting to grow in Western society. I'm just wondering, what do you think is fueling that?
Well, I think the individualism which is sort of inherent in our society, and us being, you know, told from a young age on how much we're worth and how important we are. And for example, you can see this whole process with social media and with people sort of, you know, feeling the need to share absolutely every thought that they have. I think those types of things do play into especially the development of narcissism a little bit. That said, I mean, there's nothing wrong, obviously, with a more healthy sense of self-esteem, but narcissism also, of course, has these vulnerable aspects and these defensive aspects. So it's very ego defensive. So that is actually, I think, a little bit problematic. I don't know to what extent. I mean, that the graph I showed is one study, which has, of course, been done over a long time. But yeah, I don't know to what extent this trend is still going on, or whether it's sort of topped off, or but it might be good, yeah, to think about ways in which we can keep that self-esteem development healthy, rather than it being this sort of over shouting and hiding your insecurity, etc., etc. Maybe the others have thoughts on this as well, actually.
Anyone else want to share? I've got another question. Don't think you're going to get out of this that easily. So we've got another question that actually leads really nicely into our panel that's going to be on just before 11. And that question was about toxic workplaces and how far toxic workplaces, so where we've got a very tight-knit culture that's strong and enmeshed, toxic culture, is there any hope for turnaround? I think that's a great question for organizations to think about. So who wants to start with that one?
Well, I could start, although I know that Deanne has done a lot of work on cultures. But I think with organizational culture, I think one answer is that it will take a while to change a culture, because that's very difficult to change, and it's often compared to a big ship, and you try to turn it around, it will take a while. And I think one way is to understand how culture emerges, and culture can be understood as something that is learned and that is encouraged and has helped to deal with things in the past. So if some kind of behavior worked in the past pretty well, then people will keep this behavior. And if you try to change the culture, you must change the consequences that actions have. If people notice that it doesn't work anymore, that you cannot harass other people, you cannot discriminate anymore and get along in the organization, then this is the starting point that people think again and learn that it needs to be changed. And then if you reward people who act in the way that you want the culture to be, then other people notice this and start following this behavior. And so step by step, you may be able to change the organization, but it's always difficult.
I think indeed, I fully agree with what Michael's saying here, and it's that walk the talk and do that super consistently, because if you're trying to change something and you're not super consistent about it, then that's of course going to be very tough. It's a bit strange maybe to say, but the easiest would be to try to build it up and hold on to it before this actually descends into this toxicity. Unfortunately, we see a lot of examples where it does go wrong. How is it ever okay? What happened at Boeing, at Volkswagen, etc., etc. So apparently, some processes take place. We don't really know just yet whether it sort of always goes sort of step by step, or whether it can also be this one big leap. Or so we I think need to understand a lot more about how these toxic environments develop as well.
We had a study that Deanne was involved with, led by Antoinette Weibel, and I put it into my set of science for the papers. And we were finding there that people really wanted somebody to notice that these bad things were happening and to do something to correct it. And in that paper, we have a really lovely example about an organization who tried to manage the person out of their business and be really authentic to the values that they had there. And that was a very challenging process for them to do, but they really were very, very insightful in the sense that we want to show people that there is a different way of doing the behavior. If we do it in our traditional way, we're doing the very thing that we're trying to get rid of. So we need to change, and we need to be role models for this. And so it required great resilience on the organization's part, but also great determination that they were not going to just go into a different way of being. And again, with the slides that I was highlighting, it was really showing that, you know, organizational leaders, but also line managers can often be kind of sandwiched in the middle and feeling, well, you're telling me to do this, but I'm looking up this organization and I'm seeing other people not do it. So I think it's really important that top leaders step up and behave appropriately, particularly if they say that that's what the values are of the organization, then they are the role models for that going forward. Anyone else want to add anything, Roberta?
Yes, I wanted actually to say, in a study that we are doing on actually errors and mistakes and violations, we were actually looking at the role of blaming cultures and this kind of more, and it's very difficult if you are in a context in which, you know, highlighted in my research the role of reflection. And you mentioned before the role of authenticity and be authentic and being, you know, leaders that creates the opportunities for people to reflect, to be authentic, to walk their talk and do actually what they say. But it's very difficult to change when you perceive that your context you are scared of talking, you are scared that something negative can happen to you. And this is what we are finding in this work with my colleagues, in which we have a broad set of interviews in relation to experience of mistakes and errors and how the organization, why organizations do not actually learn from their mistakes, although processes in place. And we have found how relevant is actually these feelings and this culture of blaming, the culture of being scared of talking up and reflecting. And then, although there are processes in which people can, and they are asked to reflect, they actually become a more bureaucratic process in which people say something but not actually engage in this form of reflection that is actually needed to actually improve, change, and as I said before, you know, be better. And so I think it's a very complex, and I agree that it's difficult to change culture unless there is a very clear engagement from leaders in promoting these forms of safety so that people can feel secure and psychological safety in actually reflect and change.
Michael, did you want to come in at all? I'll just add while Michael thinks about it. We've been doing another study actually, Roberta, that builds on some of the things that you were talking about, that's around the use of shame cultures in organisation. Together with computer scientists, we've been collecting information about people's experiences, and this really kind of testifies to what Michael was showing about the fact that when people feel ashamed, they hide the things that have happened. So particularly in terms of cybersecurity, it can really mean that the organisation isn't able to identify the problem quickly and respond to it, but also it means that people feel really reluctant, and also they can't then engage in any remediation and change of their behaviour because they've just tried to put it in a box and push it away from them rather than understanding, what did I do wrong? How could I do differently? And we found some really clear examples about where organizations worked with the person and didn't make them feel ashamed. They used it as a learning opportunity. Again, it had such a big impact, not only on the person who had clicked on that phishing attack, but on everybody else who saw how the organization responded and that it was a learning event rather than a shaming event. So everybody benefited from that. And I think it's really a testimony to how cultures can be hugely important in shaping and making organizations far more resilient in the future. Michael, do you want to come in and say anything there?
No, actually not.
So we have one more question, and then I'm going to suggest we take a 5-minute break before our very esteemed panel come through. So the last question is, and it kind of builds on what we've been talking about. So how can organizations then deal with wrongdoing once it's been realized? Can people be triggered into remorse or more positive behaviors? What are our thoughts there?
Happy to. Well, I don't have a specific answer in relation to the how, but definitely the importance of, as we were saying, the reflection, and this is something that we have found, how relevant it is. So feelings of guilt, remorse, and understanding, in my view, and this is what we are doing in the. So I can talk about the way we have designed the intervention for business ethics. So it's very much linked to not just, so we asked individuals, there were scenarios, realistic scenarios on the context, and we asked people to think about what they would have done and what would have been the right things to do in that situation. And we asked them to reflect about if this happened to their lives. And so it was a kind of discussion and between the participants. Here, the point is definitely the emotional experience of going back to the experience, understanding and feel remorseful and guilt is definitely, and literature has shown that this can change the behavior. However, we also focus on the problem solving. So sometimes we are facing challenges and we do something that might be wrong. The point is also in this type of training, at least from my experience, is not just focusing on these negative emotions of shame or guilty, but it's also about positively thinking about how differently we could have behaved. So we also think about that sometimes when we face a challenge, we see like our brain kinds of become a very dichotomous, right and wrong. But here in what we are doing in the trainings is actually helping individuals to take a step back and trying to find a different alternative that might be something that can help changing practices in the organization. And so in the scenarios and in the role playing during the trainings, the point is definitely one step is touching some forms of emotions related to past behavior, but not staying there, but more thinking about and learning alternative ways of dealing with the problems, that this can be learning opportunities for the organization to change practice. And this is what in the trainings, the way we have designed the trainings, that we start from an event, we start from temptations, we use the evil and angels kind of idea to explain that we might be in situation in which we have these forces, but the point is not deciding whether to go right on, one side or the other, but actually being able to use the resources of the environment, individual resources, and think about different ways of facing the challenge. And this is the way I see, at least the work where we are doing, the direction of, yes, the emotional experience, but we need also to helping individuals to find alternatives and problem-solving skills.
Thank you, Roberta. So, Michael, do you want to come in?
Yeah, what might be helpful as well is to think of three types of interventions. So at the process, do you have the intervention before something happens, the intervention in the immediate situation, and then after the event happened, so that you consider these 3 time points, and you also need to know that how you respond after the situation happens will affect future situations. I think Rose did a lot of research on trust repair, so where you need to consider these things as well. And I also agree with Roberta's point on make errors into learning opportunities. So build psychological safe environment, what a lot of research by Amy Edmondson did, or also these change the performance orientation to a learning goal orientation, where you use wrongdoings and mistakes as opportunities. And I think there's a lot of good experience in the healthcare sector where people work, they make mistakes, and instead of withholding mistakes, use these mistakes to improve the process. And I think that's a matter of the mindset, and you need to instill such a mindset in organizations.